So thank you all for speaking and providing your insights. Generated quite a few questions. And what I'll do is I'll just start off with some generic questions to get going, and then I'll also start presenting some of the viewer questions. To start off with, the first question, I guess, as an icebreaker, is how will participants be able to ensure that their technology is correctly adapted for the market? Have we got any takers for that, please?
Yeah, I'll say a few on that if you don't mind, Bea. So I think
Yeah, thank you.
I think essentially if your technology's been has robust feedback from patients, that's an important starting point relevant to your medical subspecialty, and then perhaps some proof of concept testing in a clinical environment before it even gets to a clinical trial. That would be my suggestion as a start of a 10.
Thank you. And I mean, we definitely see it from our end when we work on surgical technologies, is we're starting to do more patient focus groups and more clinician focus groups as well, because as you mentioned in your talk, quite often the technology is already developed. They think the CE marking and FDA marking is enough. But, obviously when it comes through to you guys, there isn't the evidence to demonstrate that it's actually going to make a difference to the patient. So, yeah, anyone else want to come back on that question?
I was just going to comment on the fact that I tend to work at the very early stage where something is still a concept. It's still an idea floating around someone's head. But having looked at a lot of technologies over the last 15 odd years, I feel the ones that are most successful are the ones that once they go into that early design stage is where the designers have got a lot of clinical input. So I would say, as my gut feeling is, as Noel just said, that the more that clinical input that's included in those early design ideas, I think the less risky it tends to be, and a much better chance it has of being successful at early clinical trial as well.
Thank you, Philippa. Yes, Ian?
Yeah, I agree with everything that the guy said, but I think it depends on what stage of development you're at. The type of evidence you need varies according to what stage you're at. I would agree with Philippa, you need clinical input at all stages and patient input at all stages, but you need different type of clinical input. So you might need some market research when you're developing your product. When you've got your CE mark, you might need a pilot feasibility study or even a multi-center randomized trial if you want to change NICE guidelines. So I think the type of evidence and the type of data you need from patients and clinicians varies depending on the stage of your device.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, for that. Yeah, that's certainly the case, because I mean, sometimes there's some devices or technologies that probably won't be used by the surgeon, but they'll be used by a different healthcare professional. So it's important, obviously, for the perspectives and the feedback to match that. So we've got one question in. Do you recognize in silico testing as proof of concept? I don't know if anyone wants to take that. Yes, Chris?
Thanks, Bea. In some ways, yes. In silico testing can be quite varied. So for more like computer modeling, in silico tests is actually quite a good way of generating your initial sort of proof of concept evidence, especially if you're using sort of retrospective data to do it. So in that instance, I would say yes. If it's for a medical device, that I would say that is, in my opinion, is still kind of preclinical. So it's sort of how do you then translate from your in silico test into something, real world, more sort of in vivo. So, but that's kind of the point, that we can use the data that you've done in silico and then design a study with you in order to get you to cross that barrier, probably moving towards a first in man study. We have done that locally in Leeds and I'm sure across the country in many instances. So we do have the knowledge and the expertise to do that. Often working with an academic institutions first helps with you translating that data. So that would be my advice. It kind of depends on your technology, what you're using it for, and what the in silico data is actually showing, and whether it's sort of a digital device or whether it's a sort of a medical MedTech device, can have slightly different outcomes.
Thank you, Chris. Ian, we've got someone. Sorry, I'll come back to you, Ian. Sally, yes, please go ahead.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, I would say that for exactly the sorts of technology where you might have a long-term effect, it can be really useful. I mean, I've used this kind of I mean, in effect, a sort of in silico clinical trial, but looking at screening technologies where you're looking at something that may have 20, 30 years into the future. You can look at, you know, the kind of, if you like, a sort of HTA in effect, but what you're doing is looking at something that you could never conduct a clinical trial for that length of time, but where the upfront costs are paid by one part of the NHS and the actual benefits are felt by a different part. There's no way really that you could look at that in practice by a formal clinical trial. I mean, I think it can be a really useful adjunct to cases where you would want to evaluate a standard cost effectiveness analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else want to come back on the in silico one before we ask Ian to address a question that's come through? No. So Ian, so Kate Hancock's put in response to your comments, RCTs are a challenge for smaller innovative companies. What support is available to help design fund RCTs?
Yeah, so if you know, there are NHR schemes to fund pilot and feasibility RCTs. There's specific funding streams, EME, which welcome commercial partners. So if the application is good enough and has got enough supporting data, and you know the team's right and the question's important enough, there are funding streams through the NHR, for example.
Yes, so I'll come back to you, Peter. So quickly, yeah, so the NHR, as Ian mentioned, there's the NHR EME and there's also NHR HTA. There's different funding streams. However, I think the key to accessing some of those NHR funding streams is you've really got to involve a clinical trials research unit and some of the NHR infrastructure units and academic units on board, because it does actually require significant input from those organizations in order to get a good quality application coming through. And I know, Ravi, you've also asked, you know, RCTs are surely challenging for small companies. Is there a level in between proof of concept, internal data, and RCT? You know, the MedTech cooperatives and the in vitro diagnostics cooperatives actually work within the space. So this is something that any one of the cooperatives, NHR, MedTech or in vitro diagnostic cooperatives, can actually discuss with you with regards to your need. So if you just let us know the clinical area that you're looking for, then we can certainly initiate those discussions. Peter, you wanted to say something?
Thanks, V. Just to say that the Academic Health Science Network puts together a monthly news briefing of funding opportunities that are coming up, trawled from all sorts of sources, particularly focused, of course, on the NIHR ones, but there are many others as well. We draw those together in this one news briefing, and also most of the AHSNs, certainly Wessex, where I'm from, we provide a funding support service, helping you to apply for those, helping you to work your way through the of making that application and making sure that application is as good as it can be for what you're putting forward. So do talk to your AHSN if you're thinking of a grant and you've not done it before and you're not sure how to go about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. So the next question that we'll go to is one from Kate again.
Sorry
Yes.
to interrupt. Chris had his hand up.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yes, Chris, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, V. I was just more in answer to a couple of points that came through on the chat about how the NIHR funding streams might not be SME friendly and other ways of funding. So what I would say actually in that point is, yeah, I know that NIHR is competitive, but it's working with the teams that everyone here has highlighted. It's making sure you have the right cohort of people to go into that bid with you, people who have the experience and the knowledge to do it. There are NIHR senior investigators who work at many of our institutions who can also help give weight behind it, so it can give you an increased chance. And we do have quite a few SMEs who have succeeded at, I4I grants and EMI grants as well. But that being said, there are other funding streams. So Innovate UK is obviously quite a good one to tap into. If you're a bit earlier, you can always go for an SBRI bid. Some institutions may have small pots of funding internally. Like we're looking at how to increase the amount of funding we might have available in Leeds for pilot studies, which might just need sort of 10, 20k boosters. So it is important to kind of understand how much funding you need and what you need just to get you off the ground to generate some initial data, and sort of where you are in the pipeline. So there are alternatives and there are other solutions, but you need to sort of talk with these organizations to help go in for that. Also, I'd say Wellcome and MRC have more recently been a lot more active in terms of translational based funding. So I would also look at them now. Historically, they have been more probably earlier in the pipeline, sort of more academic, sort of research driven, but more of their grants now have been more accessible to doing that kind of preclinical translational work as well. So I thought that would be a useful pointer for some of the comments going in the chat.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Chris, and thanks for raising that. I mean, in the past couple of weeks, we have basically we had a few companies who were wanting to go for the I4I funding, but it clearly wasn't suitable for them. So we were able to direct them to the Innovate UK funds. So it's very important to know which funding streams actually work well for you, for your technology, and that also work well for your company. So just another round for generic questions to go around, and I will probably start off with, I'll start off with Ben so that we can hear you speak. So one question here is, I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on real world evidence from a methodological perspective. So any comments on that?
I suppose it depends upon what you mean by from a methodological perspective. I mean, I'm interested in data science methodology and how it applies to clinical problems. So as Nick said in his presentation, there's enormous potential for modern data science methodologies in the healthcare area. And so one of the difficulties, of course, is, and there's all kinds of methodological issues concerning the rollout of these devices into the NHS and other healthcare settings. I mean, we have some of these methods, for example, are enormously powerful. They can find really, really fine patterns in data, things that human beings would miss. So they can potentially really help with clinical decision making. They wouldn't replace clinical decision making, but they could help support clinical decision making. But there are serious challenges, like sometimes they might not be very transparent. They're black boxes effectively. So they're very, very powerful, but we might not really know how they're working. So there are methodological challenges to deciphering how they're working, how they're making the decisions that they're making. Going back to the question on the in silico modeling, there's all kinds of modeling that you can do in the computer in silico. Some of it might be very, very good quality. Some of it might not be very good quality. So there are significant challenges with understanding how any modeling that's done in the computer can be validated in the real world. In other words, how useful is it actually? You might be able to reproduce some structure that you see in a training data set, but that's not really what you're looking for, actually. What you really want is a technology that will be robust enough to be of use throughout the NHS, for example. So in lots of different contexts, used in different geographic locations. So the question is, so there's an enormous number of questions about how you do that. And we're still right at the beginning of that road, really, on understanding how these technologies can best be used in the clinic, and what are the additional safeguards that are needed to ensure that they're used robustly and safely, and they can be trusted. So that's from a sort of data science perspective. I don't really know if that's what the questioner was thinking of, but that's some comments.
Yeah, no, they'll definitely let us know. Sally, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, but I'm not completely sure I've got a lot to add. I mean, I do a slightly different kind of modeling to the AI and machine learning that Ben does. I mean, I would tend to build a computer model using of a system, of a hospital system, using data from that system. And, you know, as Ben says, there's trillions and trillions of bytes, of kilobytes, and whatever there was, zettabytes of data in the NHS that is not used in the way that it absolutely could be to make the NHS function better. And I mean, absolutely, it can be used in introducing new technology as much as it can be in making the current technology just work better. I mean, I think there's obviously huge issues around the use of patient data. There's legal and confidentiality and information governance issues, which I think absolutely have to be overcome in order to exploit that data for the, you know, to its full potential. You know, and I think this sort of touches every aspect of our lives, really, the way that our data is used by organisations to sell us things. So yeah, I mean, that's probably all I have to say, really. But I completely agree that, you know, that you get garbage in, garbage out. So if the data that the model is using isn't right, then you're not going to get sensible answers from it. So models have to be absolutely validated so that you can be confident that the results they produce can be trusted.
Okay, thank you. And Leslie, any thoughts from a patient perspective?
I think a good question. As with all things, the more you involve patients and get them to understand from very early stage what it is you're trying to achieve, that it seems to me to make a fundamental difference in that the input that patients can put in and understanding what the MedTech is trying to solve really does help from those early stage interventions with patients. I think also patients, I think there's an assumption if you put the label on patients, somehow they're of less value in the room, or that the brain power is not as strong. And I think that is a very wrong assumption to make. Patients come from all walks of life, and some of them have had significant involvement in technology, etc. themselves. So they're able to bring a whole variety of experiences and professional experience to the table, as well as just lived experience of the disease. And that should not be underestimated.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I do get the point about patients being perceived as having less brain power than everybody else. And that's something we're hopefully trying to change as well in the work that we're doing. So we've got a question for Nael. Should I come to you to discuss developing a route to market for an invention currently being tested at Southampton University in health sciences? Quick yes or no.
If it involves testing something in a clinical setting before a trial, the answer is yes. If it's a technology that then requires a trial, then it would go into R&D. We managed down a slightly different pathway, but the short answer is yes.
Cool, thank you. So now there's some sort of example-based questions coming through. Who is the best person to speak to regarding support for carrying out a study with patients using a non-CE marked prototype device? Low risk.
Commercial services in the first instance. So it's a service evaluation, not a clinical trial.
Thank you very much. There's your answer, Anonymous. Anyone want to second that? Nope. Okay, and we've got a question from, yes, Peter, go on.
I would just say I didn't catch all of the question, but just to make sure that they really have checked whether it is regulatable or not, because if it is a regulated device, then it's important that it goes through the normal. process, which might include a patient trial, but also includes literature searching and comparison with other products. So it's really important that you understand the regulatory status of your device, not make assumptions about it, but check that back against the regulations. And if you're not sure, go to the MHRA for their advice.
Yeah,
thank you, Peter. Yeah, very, very, very sound advice. Yeah, so definitely check the regulatory status. And you can contact you can contact us through the panel and through the links on the right hand side of the screen. So Dean Harris has got a question. Can an interventional clinical trial be conducted before CECA mark approval? And is given the example of a cancer diagnostic support test as a refer and non-refer decision tool. Who wants to take that? Ian, Peter? Yes, Peter?
So some testing will have to be done before its regulatory approval is given. So that's done under the context of a formal clinical trial. But you'd need to know, I'd need to know more before I could give any better advice on that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so some of these will require sort of more in-depth discussion. So Ian, there's a question here. Do trusts have a list of areas of interest in regards to research topics?
I've only ever worked in one trust. Certainly, our trust, Hull University NHS Hospitals Trust, has areas of research interest: vascular surgery, palliative care, renal medicine, respiratory medicine, are the main clinical areas of research activity. And most trusts, it's impossible for all trusts to cover all clinical areas, and most trusts will have higher levels of research activity in specific clinical areas. But I'm not aware of a specific list anywhere that lists, which trusts have interest in which areas.
Yep, anyone else? Peter, go ahead.
Just on that last one, obviously the NIHR Clinical Research Network has a really clear view on where the research streams are in each hospital within its own region. So well worth contacting them in the first place before sort of trying to make contact yourself, because they've got lists of research active clinicians in most of the main clinical disciplines and can line you up with the right place and the right person. V, you can probably speak better to that than I can.
Yeah, definitely. So the Clinical Research Network, they've got specialty groups. So they do cover just about every disease area grouping is covered by these specialty groups. And those specialty groups are run by clinicians and other healthcare professionals working within that area. And they will definitely be able to advise on areas of interest and areas for prioritizing. And you've got the mix, the MedTech and in vitro diagnostics cooperatives, but obviously those will be limited depending on what clinical areas that they cover. But the clinical research networks, as Peter has mentioned, will be an ideal starting place. So I will just move on to one more question, seeing as time's running out. But here's one that was bound to come up. So it's regards to intellectual property. Should NHS trusts co-own IP when using NHS standard care data? Surveys have shown patients are cautious about sharing data with commercial partners and expect benefit to the NHS. So what should we do about intellectual property and the NHS? Niall, go first.
It's not an easy question to answer.
You're on mute, I think. We can't hear you.
However, usually if patients have...
Niall, you're on mute.
I am indeed. Let's just unmute myself.
He's actually okay.
I am okay. I'm not muted.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, so essentially if the projects, normally before a project that is specific, we would seek, through a patient survey, maybe 100 responses and get views about very specific issue around intellectual property. Because if there's a commercialization angle involved, you don't want a negative reaction which could damage your institution's reputation. So that would be one step to take. As a general rule of thumb, most patients will support the use of their data if it's going to lead to the development of new technology or therapeutics. But in terms of protecting the IP, yeah, the ownership depends. The ownership, both, it depends who the let's say it's a clinician. It depends who's come up with the idea. It depends where their primary contract sits, who owns the IP, what share the trust has in, or the university has in the IP, depending upon the arrangement. It could be jointly created IP, so it's not straightforward. And there's no central guidance at the moment, so we have to approach it on a case-by-case basis and be very careful.
I've got a couple of thoughts as well on that, V. I think exactly as Niall said, I think each trust will have slightly different policies around IP. So I know that we have our own internal IP policy, which needs to be adhered to, which is both for internal and external use. What's very key is to ensure that sort of a collaboration agreement is put in place around IP, sort of who owns the background IP, and then what is designed jointly as foreground IP. Make sure that's defined very early. With regards to patient involvement in that, I would also agree with the comment that they're actually, patients get very open about it, and actually certain trusts have electronic healthcare record systems established where people almost automatically consent to the use of their data for retrospective type studies to develop new solutions. So there are certain trusts in the country, which Leeds is one of them, where you can access that data to retrospectively, so that all of the data is anonymized and that it's ensured that it's safe and it ticks all of the governance boxes as well. If not, then you bring the patient to the table and talk to them about it. This is where patient and public involvement groups are vital as part of your development pathway. So IP is a very long conversation to have. It is, so it's best to actually have that conversation early. But there are certainly ways around it to make the process a bit easier, and working with the right teams to do so.
Thank you, Chris. And I think we've got time just to slot in one more question, and I'm quite keen for Philippa to say something here. Yeah, so we've got a question from Ira. It says, for example, we've developed a device and platform to diagnose brain cancer early with non-invasive techniques, e.g. blood biomarker. What would be your advice on how it could be adopted by the NHS?
Right, so really that is kind of, there's an element of exploring your route to market. So there's some work there to be done as to, I don't know if you want to take it direct or work with an existing partner. I think there's also work to be done around exploring true need from the sort of pathology sector as well around that detection. Generally, with sort of route to market studies, my advice is to not exclude any voice. So although the principal target of trying to get to the bottom of that question would be talking to the laboratories that be doing the testing. However, there's the bigger picture around that. So there'd be the clinicians and how are they diagnosing, what would be the impact on the care pathway of an earlier diagnosis, what would be the cost implication of rolling out maybe a new diagnostic pathway that maybe is replacing something that's not already there, or something that's more expensive or more difficult to do. Also, from a procurement point of view, there's issues there in terms of who buys and who benefits from implementing that testing protocol and on what scale. So there's not a quick and easy answer to that question, but by exploring all of those avenues, you will start to see a pathway through that. So I hope that is of some help to answer that question.
Thank you, Philippa. Any other thoughts on that question from other panel members? Nope. Okay, so we got one more question we haven't answered, and it might be a bit of a tough one. Maybe it's just tough for me. But what are your thoughts on developing a viable business model for technologies that are still in the early stages of R&D, particularly if funded by an EU consortium? So what are your thoughts on developing a viable business model? Who's going to be brave to go first before I pick somebody?
I'll give it a go. I'll give it a go, V. It depends what they mean by that, because for me, I think a business case should come later. You often don't have enough evidence to genuinely come up with a decent enough business case. So, I mean, I'd like to understand more by what they mean, but my advice would be to yes, understand your market and put forward sort of a market assessment and benefit, and define the unmet need and everything else that's been said in the talks today, really. So that, build that into almost like an outline business case for what you want to do and take forwards. But in terms of actually that final model, you won't realistically know what that is until you've performed all of your studies, before you've done the health economic testing on it, which is going to be vital, before you've got the patients on board. So don't rush too far ahead would be my advice, because you may end up working a lot on a document that actually doesn't have that much value. And yes, the HSNs are here, and the different members of the trust are here to talk to give you an idea of what that outline business case would look like. But I wouldn't go beyond that point until you've actually done the key next steps. So learn to walk before you run, I guess, is the advice.
Any other thoughts? Yes, now.
If you get to the stage of a viable proposition where you think there's a business case, then always consider the resource implications for the institution, whether there's a need for resource to help interface development, if it's a digital technology, or if there's implementation costs, and therefore this is often something that's left out. So we know that health services are very, very stretched because they're playing catch up because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and therefore most technologies need some element of coordination support, which isn't there in the first place, to make them happen, to enable them to be delivered in a real clinical environment. So that's important, and often left out, but just consider that when you're thinking about the funding.
Yeah, thank you for that insight as well. So I think our time is up, but does anyone have any last thoughts, any one word of advice for our budding SMEs and those that are trying to get their technologies through? What one thing would you pass on to them? Yes, Peter, you can go first.
Market research, then more market research. Speak to the actual stakeholders, the people that know. Don't go guessing it, and don't just speak to your friends.
Thank you. Leslie?
Patient and put the patient voice right in there from the earliest stages.
Thank you. Sally?
So yes, I mean, I would again, I just echo the look at the entire field of stakeholders, not just think about your device and what can it be used for. The other way around, what need is it going to meet?
Yeah, thank you. Nail?
I don't think enough emphasis can be put upon the value proposition, and if you're thinking about a technology and that being adopted by the NHS, the fundamental question to ask is why should the NHS why should they purchase the technology? That's a really important question to answer, and have a really clear answer to that, and that's something that both the trust and an NHSN will ask you.
Thank you. Philippa?
I'm going to reiterate the importance of market research early on, but in addition to patients and clinicians, I think the most successful devices are the ones where the needs of every touch point have been taken in. So if you've got a very large piece of kit, that can be right from facilities and estates to maintenance to medical physics, anybody who's going to interact with that device will have some view and some input into whether it's going to succeed or fail, and every viewpoint along that stage needs to be incorporated.
Thank you. Ian?
Yeah, just to add to everybody else's views, really, involve clinicians, involve patients, involve methodologists, statisticians, economists if needs be. And make sure there's a unmet need, because your success rates will be much higher.
Yep, thank you. Ben?
I think to resist the temptation to do what is of interest to you and of no use to anyone else.
It's a nice way of putting it. Thank you. And finally, Chris?
Thanks, Fee. Similar advice, really. Come to us early. It's always better to fail early if that's the end outcome, or succeed quicker by doing so. And also remember that the NHS is a big organisation. There are many entry points. Find the right point for you, and we're always quite open to work across multiple institutions as well. So I think it's worth bearing that in mind, that you can work with people all over the country, and just make sure you have a good fit.
Yep. Yeah, so thank you all. And I won't add too much to that. But for anyone who's listening, if the NHR is still a mystery and the whole landscape is still a mystery to you, definitely get in touch with NOCRI. I will put a link up in the chat, but they will be able to signpost you to different NHR facilities and other units as well that can help you with all the points that our panelists have said. You can, after this discussion closes, if you go on your left-hand side, there's Expo. You can definitely go in there and have a chat with any of the guys behind the virtual exhibition booths. But I would like to say a huge thank you to all our panelists for taking the time out on this sunny Tuesday. I know you'd rather be outside, so I won't keep you too long from that, and let you enjoy whatever's left of the sun, just in case the rain decides to make a comeback. But thank you very much. And if anyone wants to be connected with any of the panelists or wants to find out how they can get in touch, then please please contact Impact Ventures, either Gemma or Costa, and they will be able to facilitate those introductions for you. So thank you once again, and please have a lovely afternoon. Have a nosy around at the expo with the virtual exhibition booths, and definitely make your connections. So thank you all once again.